Queen Elizabeth asked back in 2008, why did no one see it coming? She was talking about the financial crisis in those days. And of course, there was sort of a good reason why central banks didn't see it coming back then. And that's because they had converted to inflation targeting mandates. They were really very focused on inflation as their target. And so financial stability had become a bit of an orphan. But of course, they don't have that excuse this time around. Why didn't they see inflation coming in 2021? Because inflation, is their target, is their raison d'etre.
Welcome back to Breakout from Breakingviews, sponsored by PGIM. I'm Peter Thalassen, the global editor of Breakingviews, and I'm being joined by Felix Martin. Felix, welcome back to Breakout.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's great to be back again after the summer.
So, Felix, there's obviously been lots going on over the summer, but you are writing for us this week about the thorny question of inflation, and particularly the question that Queen Elizabeth asked in a different context back in 2008, which is, why did no one see this coming? So tell us a bit about how you think about this question.
That's right, Peter. I mean, I've tackled this week because, of course, it's at the heart of the question of where monetary policy is going next, and whether what central banks have done so far to tackle inflation has been the right thing, or too much, or too little. And I think that's really on investors' minds at the moment. So, as you said, Queen Elizabeth asked back in 2008, why did no one see it coming? She was talking about the financial crisis in those days. And of course, there was sort of a good reason why central banks didn't see it coming back then. And that's because they had converted to inflation targeting mandates. They were really very focused on inflation as their target. And so financial stability had become a bit of an orphan. But of course, they don't have that excuse this time around. Why didn't they see inflation coming in 2021? Because inflation, is their target, is their raison d'etre.
Yeah, it's their core job, and obviously, they sort of thought it would be short and not very severe, and obviously it's been much longer and more severe than expected. So I guess then you have to answer that question, you have to go a little bit back to the sort of different theories of inflation, and what have we learned in the past few years about those theories?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the Bank of England, as I mentioned in this piece, they've been the first sort of central bank to actually tackle this question head on. They've appointed Ben Bernanke, the ex-chairman of the US Federal Reserve, to do a review of their modeling and forecasting. And I mean, one thing to mention is that there's some people have revived what is a very old debate, actually, in economic forecasting about whether you need to build these complicated models of the economy that try and explain all the different causal links between what central banks do and where inflation ends up, or whether, in fact, you should just use purely statistical methods of forecasting, just look at correlations between data and make predictions of inflation that way. Now, it's been known for a very long time, since the 80s at least, even with relatively primitive statistical methods, that those kinds of forecasts can often be better than the ones that come out of these complex models. And of course, today, in the age of machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on, the wind is in the sails of those who think that actually maybe central banks should give up on all this complex stuff and just use statistical modeling.
But you still need a theoretical framework, don't you, to sort of an explanation for not just what is happening, but why it's happening.
You do. That's exactly right. I would caution that it's a bit of a siren song, this idea that you can just rely on these kinds of statistical models, because what policymakers need is that explanation in causal terms. They need to know not just where inflation might be next month, but why it will be there and what difference it would make if they implemented certain different policies. So when it comes to the theories of inflation, then we have to look at the mainstream one, so-called new Keynesian theory. That's what most central banks use these days. And that's couched in terms of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And the idea is that, if you run the economy too hot, inflation goes up. If you manage to bring unemployment up, you cool things down, inflation will go down. That's the mainstream theory. But of course, that's the one which didn't spot inflation coming in 2021.
Yeah. So then we go back and look at other theories. So
That's right. That's exactly right. And so I think there are two big sort of areas where the critics have appeared in the last couple of years, and they're being taken seriously by central bankers. You can see that in a lot of speeches recently. One is critics who say you need to focus much more on the supply side, these disruptions coming from the pandemic, coming from the energy shock, from the war in Ukraine, and so on. So there have been some significant interventions on that side saying, listen, we need to look at the way that firms' pricing power, so-called greedflation, has fed into the inflationary process, the way that social conflicts and one group in society trying to get ahead of another, that contributes to inflation. It's all sort of reviving ideas from the 1970s. And then the other big criticism, of course, has come from another old theory. It's the monetarist camp, people who say, look, it's not imbalances between supply and demand for goods and services that feed inflation. It's all about the supply and demand of money, and central banks need to get back to focusing on the money supply, measuring it and making sure it doesn't grow too quickly.
So there's lots of different sort of things to play with there. I mean, I guess the problem with all of these theories ultimately is that if you try and build a sort of a simple rule for trying to sort of steer the economy or how you set interest rates, any one theory that you use will probably break down.
I mean, that's exactly right. That was the problem with monetarism when it was adopted previously, and it goes also to the question of to what extent central banks can really control these different drivers, even if they are there. I think it's quite clear from the evidence that actually all these factors have played a part, for example, in the current inflationary episode. But can central banks really play a role in controlling social discord when it leads to inflation? I'm not sure they can. And indeed, have they proved able to control the money supply historically when they've adopted monetarist targets? Well, the historical record isn't so great, unfortunately.
So, Felix, well, that's really fascinating and sort of lots of food for thought there, and also food for further thinking about what other approaches might be next. But I suppose for now, we just have to conclude that the Queen's question, or this version of the Queen's question, will remain unanswered.
Yeah, or rather, I think there are many different answers, but unfortunately, there's no one solution to this difficult question.
Right. Great, Felix. Always good to talk to you. As ever, thanks very much. You can read Felix's column on breakingviews.com, and we will be back in future weeks with further editions of Breakout.